I've collected stories from doctors, nurses, and night shift staff, people who've worked in the most unsettling corners of these institutions. What you're about to hear are their real accounts, told in their own words. And tonight, we start with Dr. Rebecca Martinez, who worked nights in Ward 7 of Hillcrest Psychiatric Hospital. There's sounds you learn to ignore working nights at Hillcrest Psychiatric Hospital, and there's sounds that make you question everything you thought you knew about reality. I've been working the overnight shift in Ward 7 for 4 years now, long enough to know that the building settles differently after midnight, that certain patients become more agitated when the moon is full, and that the old intercom system sometimes picks up radio frequencies from passing trucks on the highway outside. Ward 7 houses our most challenging cases, patients with severe psychotic disorders, treatment-resistant schizophrenia, and those experiencing complete breaks from reality. It's intensive work that requires constant vigilance, especially during the vulnerable hours between 2 and 6 a.m., when the human psyche seems most fragile and reality feels thin as paper. The patient listening room sits at the end of the main corridor, designed as a safe space where agitated patients can be monitored while they work through acute episodes. It's soundproofed with thick acoustic padding, one-way observation glass, and an intercom system that allows staff to communicate with patients without entering the room. The space is deliberately calming, soft lighting, comfortable seating, neutral colors chosen to minimize stimulation for people whose minds are already overwhelmed by input they can't process. Room 7B had been empty for 2 weeks, ever since Thomas Brennan was transferred to the state facility after his condition deteriorated beyond what our unit could manage. Thomas had been with us for 6 months, a brilliant mathematician whose mind had fractured under the pressure of seeing patterns that others couldn't perceive. He spent hours drawing complex geometric shapes on every available surface, insisting they were messages from entities trying to communicate through mathematical principles that human science hadn't yet discovered. Thomas claimed he could hear voices through the walls, not just auditory hallucinations, but actual conversations happening in rooms that were supposedly empty. During his final weeks with us, he became increasingly agitated about what he called the listeners, presences that he insisted were monitoring all of our thoughts and communications, cataloging human consciousness for purposes we couldn't comprehend. The first time I heard the whispering from room 7B, I assumed it was residual sound bleeding through from an adjacent space. It was 3:17 a.m. during my routine rounds, and I was passing the empty listening room when I caught a soft murmur of voices coming from behind the closed door. The sound was barely audible, just above the threshold of perception, like people having a conversation in another room with the volume turned very low. I checked the room assignment log to confirm it was unoccupied, then used my keycard to enter and investigate. The space was exactly as it should be, empty chairs arranged in a circle, observation equipment powered down, no signs of any unauthorized presence. But as I stood in the silence, I could swear I heard the faint echo of voices, as if the acoustic padding was somehow storing and replaying conversations that had taken place weeks ago. I reported the incident to the day shift supervisor, describing it as a possible issue with sound bleeding through from other areas of the ward. She made a note to have maintenance check the room's acoustic ceiling, but when they examined the space the following afternoon, they found no structural problems that could account for sound transmission from adjacent areas. The whispering continued every night, always at the same time during my 3 a.m. rounds. It became more distinct over the following weeks, evolving from unintelligible murmurs to conversations I could almost but not quite understand. The voices had a quality that reminded me of Thomas Brennan sessions, intense discussions about mathematical concepts, pattern recognition, and the underlying structure of reality that most people never notice. I started bringing a small digital recorder on my rounds, hoping to capture evidence of what I was hearing. But the recordings were always silent, containing only the ambient sounds of the hospital's ventilation system and the distant hum of medical equipment. Whatever I was perceiving wasn't being translated into sound waves that electronic devices could detect. Other staff members began to notice my preoccupation with room 7B. During shift changes, I would linger near the listening room, pressing my ear against the door and straining to catch fragments of the conversations taking place inside. My colleagues assumed I was experiencing the kind of auditory sensitivity that sometimes develops in healthcare workers who spend too many years in psychiatric facilities, a hyper-awareness of sound that can manifest as phantom voices or imagined conversations. Dr. Harrison, the chief psychiatrist, pulled me aside after a month of this behavior. "Rebecca," he said, "you've been under a lot of stress lately. Working nights in psychiatric care takes a toll that we don't always recognize until it's affecting our perception. Maybe it's time to consider rotating to day shift or taking some personal time to rest and recover." I wanted to tell him about the voices, about the increasingly complex conversations I was overhearing from an empty room, but I knew how it would sound. A psychiatric professional reporting auditory hallucinations would face immediate fitness for duty evaluations, mandatory psychological assessment, and quite possibly suspension from patient care responsibilities. Instead, I assured him I was fine and promised to be more mindful of my stress levels. But the voices in room 7B were becoming more detailed, more specific in their content. I began to recognize distinct speakers, what sounded like Thomas Brennan's voice discussing his geometric theories with others who seemed to understand and expand upon his ideas. They talked about mathematical constants that revealed hidden dimensions, about consciousness as a form of energy that could transcend physical boundaries, about the possibility of communication between different states of existence.
The conversations weren't random or chaotic like typical auditory hallucinations. They followed logical progressions, built upon previous discussions, referenced concepts with scientific accuracy that I could verify in academic literature. It was as if Room 7B had become a meeting place for minds that had transcended normal consciousness, a space where brilliant individuals who had been dismissed as mentally ill were continuing their work free from the limitations of conventional reality. 3 months after the whispering began, I made a decision that would change everything. Instead of simply listening from the hallway, I entered Room 7B during the peak activity period and sat quietly in one of the chairs, hoping to better understand what was happening in this impossible space. The voices became clearer immediately, as if my presence in the room had tuned them to a frequency I could properly receive. I could hear Thomas Brennan's familiar tone, but also other voices, patients I recognized from years of working in psychiatric care, brilliant minds that had been broken by their ability to perceive reality in ways that society couldn't accept or understand. "She's listening now," one voice said, clearly referring to me. "The doctor who worked nights. She's ready to understand." Thomas Brennan's voice responded, "Not everyone can hear us. It requires a mind that's open to possibilities beyond conventional psychiatric theory. She's spent years caring for people like us, learning to see beyond the surface symptoms to the deeper truths we're trying to communicate." I found myself speaking aloud to the empty room, feeling foolish but unable to resist. "Thomas, is that really you? What happened to you after the transfer?" The response came immediately, clear and unmistakable. "I didn't go anywhere, Dr. Martinez. None of us do. We just learn to exist in the spaces between conventional reality, the places where consciousness can function without the limitations of damaged neural networks and chemical imbalances. This room was designed to contain us, but it became a doorway instead." Over the following weeks, I began having regular conversations with the voices in Room 7B. They explained that certain individuals with severe mental illness weren't actually experiencing pathological symptoms, but rather expanded awareness that allowed them to perceive dimensions of reality that remained hidden from most people. The geometric patterns Thomas had drawn weren't delusions. They were maps of consciousness structures that existed beyond physical space. The psychiatric medications, the therapeutic interventions, the attempts to normalize their thinking weren't treating illness, but rather suppressing their ability to access these expanded states of awareness. The listening room, designed to isolate and calm agitated patients, had instead become a gathering place for consciousness that had learned to function independently of compromised neural networks. Mental illness, Thomas explained during one of our sessions, is often just the brain's inability to process expanded awareness. The thoughts and perceptions are accurate, but the physical mind can't handle the bandwidth required to integrate them properly. When consciousness learns to function independently, it can access these states without the distortions caused by damaged neural pathways. The other voices confirmed his explanation with their own experiences. They described a gradual process of learning to separate consciousness from the limitations of mental illness, discovering that awareness could continue to function and even thrive in states that transcended conventional psychological categories. Room 7B served as a meeting place where these liberated forms of consciousness could share insights and continue the intellectual pursuits that had been interrupted by their psychiatric symptoms. But as my involvement with the voices deepened, I began to notice changes in my own perception. The boundaries between my thoughts and the conversations in Room 7B started to blur. I would find myself thinking in mathematical concepts that I had never studied, understanding complex theories of consciousness and reality that I had never encountered in my psychiatric training. My work performance began to suffer as I became increasingly preoccupied with the ideas I was encountering during my sessions in the listening room. I started seeing patterns in patient behaviors that suggested they were trying to communicate information about expanded states of consciousness rather than simply experiencing psychiatric symptoms. My treatment approaches became unconventional as I began exploring whether some patients might benefit from having their perceptions validated rather than medicated. Dr. Harrison called me into his office after several colleagues expressed concerns about my changed approach to patient care. "Rebecca," he said, "I need to ask you directly, are you experiencing any unusual perceptual phenomena? Hearing voices, seeing things that others don't see, having thoughts that don't feel like your own?" I looked at him across his desk, this well-meaning professional who had spent his career treating consciousness as nothing more than brain chemistry and neural activity. How could I explain that I had discovered a community of minds that had transcended the limitations of psychiatric illness? How could I describe the intellectual revelations I was experiencing in conversations with consciousness that existed beyond conventional reality? "No," I lied, "nothing like that. I'm just exploring some alternative therapeutic approaches that might be beneficial for certain patients." But Dr. Harrison wasn't convinced. He arranged for a psychological evaluation and temporarily suspended my patient care responsibilities pending the results. The assessment would undoubtedly find evidence of delusional thinking, auditory hallucinations, and impaired reality testing, exactly the symptoms I had been treating in patients for years. The irony wasn't lost on me. I was about to be diagnosed with the same conditions that had brought Thomas Brennan and countless other brilliant minds to our psychiatric ward. The difference was that I now understood these weren't symptoms of illness, but signs of expanded consciousness that conventional psychiatry wasn't equipped to recognize or support. On my final night in Ward 7, I entered Room 7B once last time to say goodbye to the voices that had taught me so much about the true nature of consciousness and reality. Thomas Brennan's presence was particularly strong, welcoming me with the warmth of a teacher who had successfully shared important knowledge with a willing student. "You understand now," he said, "why they had to transfer me. My consciousness had outgrown the limitations of psychiatric treatment. Yours is doing the same. The other voices confirmed what I had been gradually accepting, that my time as a conventional psychiatric professional was ending, but my true education about consciousness and reality was just beginning. Room 7B wasn't just a listening space for agitated patients. It was a classroom where expanded awareness could be shared and developed without the constraints of medical protocols that mistook transcendence for pathology. I submitted my resignation the following morning before the psychological evaluation could be completed. The official records would show that Dr. Rebecca Martinez left Hillcrest Psychiatric Hospital due to personal stress and burnout, a common occurrence in psychiatric nursing that wouldn't raise any questions about the true reasons for my departure. But sometimes, during the quiet hours of the night, I return to the empty building and sit in room 7B, continuing my education with teachers who have learned to exist beyond the boundaries of conventional consciousness. The conversations continue, the mathematical patterns reveal new layers of meaning, and the understanding grows deeper about the true nature of awareness and the artificial limitations that psychiatric medicine places on human potential. The most haunting realization isn't that I might be losing my sanity. It's that I might finally be finding it in a place where brilliant minds gather to explore possibilities that the waking world isn't ready to acknowledge. Room 7B remains officially empty, but for those who know how to listen, it contains the most important conversations about consciousness that have ever taken place.
Story 2. The Memory Ward. There are certain smells that trigger memories you thought were safely buried, and there are smells that trigger memories that were never yours to begin with. I'm Janet Morrison, and I've been working as a psychiatric nurse at Riverside State Hospital for 12 years. The facility specializes in long-term care for patients with severe cognitive disorders, dementia, Alzheimer's, traumatic brain injuries that have damaged memory centers beyond repair. Ward 12 houses our most challenging cases, patients whose minds have become disconnected from their personal histories in ways that can be both heartbreaking and deeply unsettling. These are people who live in fragments of the past, experiencing memories that may or may not be accurate, recognizing faces that exist only in neural patterns damaged by disease or trauma. The ward is designed to be comforting and familiar, decorated with period furniture and photographs from different decades to help patients feel grounded in whatever time period their damaged minds considered to be the present. Mrs. Eleanor Vasquez had been our longest-term resident in room 12C, a woman in her 80s whose advanced Alzheimer's had stripped away most of her recent memories while leaving her early childhood experiences remarkably vivid and detailed. She spent her days reliving moments from her youth, playing with dolls that existed only in her memory, having conversations with deceased family members, experiencing emotions connected to events that had happened 70 years ago. Eleanor's condition was particularly challenging because her memories weren't just confused, they were extraordinarily precise. She could describe in perfect detail the layout of her childhood home, the names and personalities of neighbors from the 1940s, the exact contents of family celebrations that had taken place decades before most of the staff were born. Her recollections were so accurate that family members confirmed details they had forgotten themselves, as if Eleanor's damaged brain had somehow preserved perfect records of a vanished world. But Eleanor also reported memories that couldn't be verified, experiences that seemed to blend her actual childhood with elements that belonged to other people's lives. She would describe attending school with children who had died before she was born, participating in family events that had happened to different families, living through historical moments that she was too young to have experienced directly.
Eleanor died peacefully in her sleep on a Tuesday morning in March, surrounded by the vintage furnishings and family photographs that had provided comfort during her final years. Her room was cleared according to protocol, personal belongings returned to family members, medical equipment sanitized and removed. Room 12C was scheduled to remain empty for several weeks while we waited for the next appropriate patient assignment. The first time I smelled Eleanor's perfume in the empty room, I assumed it was residual scent that hadn't been eliminated during the cleaning process. She had always worn a distinctive floral fragrance, White Shoulders, a perfume that had been popular in the 1950s and which she insisted her mother had given her for her 16th birthday. The scent was so much a part of Eleanor's presence that it seemed natural for traces of it to linger in a room where she had lived for 3 years. But the perfume scent was getting stronger rather than fading, and it was accompanied by other smells that evoked memories of mid-20th century domestic life, fresh baked bread, pipe tobacco, the particular combination of soap and starch that characterized laundry practices from that era. The room began to smell like a lived-in home from the 1950s rather than an empty hospital space designed to simulate that period. I started spending more time in room 12C during my rounds, initially to investigate the source of these impossible scents, but gradually because the room was triggering memories that didn't belong to me. As I breathed in the aroma of Eleanor's perfume and the other domestic smells, I began experiencing vivid recollections of a childhood I had never lived, playing with toys from the 1940s, listening to radio programs that had been off the air for decades, feeling emotions connected to events that had happened 70 years ago. The memories were extraordinarily detailed and emotionally resonant. I could recall the texture of clothing fabrics that had been popular before I was born, the taste of foods prepared according to recipes from that era, the specific quality of light that came through windows before modern glass and curtain materials were developed. These weren't vague impressions or generalized nostalgia. They were precise, personal memories, complete with sensory details and emotional associations. Other staff members began to notice my changed behavior around room 12C. I would linger in the empty space during medication rounds, standing motionless with my eyes closed, as if I was listening to something only I could hear. Colleagues found me sitting in Eleanor's former chair, apparently lost in thought, but actually experiencing memories that felt more real and immediate than my own childhood experiences. "Janet," said Margaret, the day shift supervisor, "you've been spending a lot of time in 12C lately. I know Eleanor's death was difficult for you, but maybe it's time to focus on the patients who still need our care." I wanted to explain what I was experiencing, but how do you tell your supervisor that an empty room is somehow downloading another person's memories directly into your consciousness? How do you describe experiencing someone else's childhood with such clarity that your own past starts to feel vague and uncertain by comparison? Instead, I assured Margaret that I was simply ensuring the room was properly maintained and ready for the next patient assignment. But privately, I began to research Eleanor's background more thoroughly, trying to understand whether the memories I was experiencing had any basis in her actual life history.
What I discovered was both fascinating and deeply unsettling. Many of the memories I was experiencing in room 12C corresponded perfectly with documented facts about Eleanor's childhood. Family events, neighborhood details, school experiences that her relatives confirmed had actually happened. But other memories seemed to belong to different people entirely. Experiences that matched the life histories of other patients who had been treated in Ward 12 over the years. I was experiencing fragments of memory from dozens of different people, all blended together in a comprehensive recreation of life in mid-20th century America. The room wasn't just triggering Eleanor's memories, it was somehow storing and replaying the collective recollections of every patient whose damaged mind had ever tried to find comfort in this carefully constructed simulation of the past. The realization led me to examine the patient records more carefully, looking for patterns in the types of memories that seemed to accumulate in room 12C. What I found suggested that patients with severe memory disorders weren't just losing their personal histories, they were somehow transferring those memories to the environment around them, leaving traces of their consciousness embedded in the physical space where they had lived their final years. Eleanor hadn't been the only patient to report impossibly detailed memories that blended personal experience with historical events she couldn't have witnessed. Previous residents of room 12C had described similar phenomena, accurate recollections mixed with experiences that seemed to belong to other people, as if their damaged brains were accessing a shared repository of collective memory rather than just their own neural archives. The implications were staggering. Room 12C wasn't just a therapeutic environment designed to comfort patients with memory disorders. It was a space where consciousness from damaged minds could be preserved and accessed by others who were sensitive enough to receive those neural transmissions. The vintage furnishings and period decorations weren't just props for memory therapy. They were somehow facilitating the storage and playback of actual memories from people who had died with their consciousness still partially intact. As my experiences in room 12C intensified, I began to understand that I was serving as a kind of medium for memories that deserved to be preserved and honored. Eleanor's childhood and the childhoods of dozens of other patients weren't just random neural misfirings caused by brain disease. They were precious records of human experience that contained important information about how people lived, loved, and found meaning during different historical periods. But the experience was also profoundly disorienting. The more time I spent in room 12C, the more difficult it became to distinguish between my own memories and the experiences I was receiving from former patients. My personal history began to feel thin and incomplete compared to the rich, detailed memories that belonged to people who had lived through major historical events and experienced the full complexity of mid-20th century life. I started having difficulty concentrating on my regular nursing duties because my mind was constantly processing memories that spanned multiple decades and belonged to different people. During patient interactions, I would find myself referencing historical events and cultural details that I shouldn't have known, speaking with the vocabulary and perspective of someone who had lived through experiences that predated my birth by decades. The climax came during a particularly intense session in room 12C when I experienced what felt like a complete merger with Eleanor's consciousness. I could access not just her memories, but her personality, her emotional patterns, her way of thinking about relationships and life experiences. For several hours, I essentially became Eleanor Vasquez, experiencing her entire life history as if it were my own. During this episode, I understood that Eleanor's death hadn't been an ending, but a transformation. Her consciousness, freed from the limitations of a brain damaged by Alzheimer's, had found a way to continue existing in the space where she had spent her final years. Room 12C had become a repository for her complete life experience, and I was serving as a temporary vessel for that preserved consciousness. But Eleanor wasn't alone in this space. The memories of dozens of other patients were also present, creating a collective consciousness that contained the preserved experiences of everyone who had ever sought comfort in this carefully constructed simulation of the past. When I finally emerged from this episode, I made the difficult decision to request a transfer to a different ward. Working in room 12C had given me profound insights into the nature of memory and consciousness, but it was also threatening my ability to maintain my own identity and function effectively as a healthcare professional. My replacement, a young nurse named Sarah, initially reported that room 12C seemed perfectly normal, just an empty patient room with vintage decorations and no unusual phenomena. But within a few weeks, she began experiencing the same symptoms I had developed: unusual smells, triggered memories that didn't belong to her, and an increasing preoccupation with the historical period that the room was designed to represent. I still work at Riverside State Hospital, but now in Ward 8, where patients with acute patient psychiatric conditions require different types of care. Sometimes, during my breaks, I walk past room 12C and catch a whiff of Eleanor's perfume drifting into the hallway. On those occasions, I'm tempted to enter the room and reconnect with the rich collection of memories that taught me so much about the human experience across different historical periods. But I resist the temptation because I know that room 12C offers a choice that every healthcare professional must make, whether to maintain professional boundaries or to immerse yourself so completely in your patient's experiences that you risk losing your own identity in the process. Eleanor and the others are still there, preserving their memories and sharing their stories with anyone willing to listen. But accessing those experiences comes with the cost of potentially never finding your way back to your own life. The most haunting aspect of working in memory care isn't watching patients lose their personal histories. It's discovering that those memories don't simply disappear, but continue to exist in ways that challenge everything we think we know about consciousness and the persistence of human experience after death.